Okay, so let's finish up Galatians chapter 2 now, and we're going to see faith plus nothing lived out. We're going to see how this begins to be lived out, this idea of salvation by faith alone and nothing more, this grace of God, this gift of God. Chapter 2, verse 11, when Peter came to Antioch, Paul says this, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when these guys came from Jerusalem, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. So let me explain the situation. Peter was in Antioch, living among the Gentiles according to the new revelation. So that means he's probably eating pork, he's eating lobster, he's eating all this stuff he wasn't allowed to eat before as a Jew. And then some leaders come from Jerusalem. They show up, and Peter starts to bail on his convictions. He starts to think, wait a second, I don't want them to think the wrong thing about me. And he starts to back away, not only from the food, but probably also from the table, because Jews weren't supposed to have table fellowship with Gentiles. In fact, Paul writes in verse 13 that others joined in the hypocrisy. Even Paul's friend Barnabas was persuaded to do the same thing. So Paul says this, verse 14, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of all of them, you're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile, not like a Jew. In other words, you know that you have freedom in Christ, even though you're a Jew. You've had the revelation from Acts 10. We know all this. You live like a Gentile. And then he says this, how is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? Because this is what was happening. If Peter was backing away, he was implying that those rules and customs did mean something. And so basically he's implying that the Gentiles should have to obey the Jewish customs and laws. And Paul's saying that's hypocrisy. Paul had to call Peter out on this. And then he explains his equation again. Here's how he says it in verse 15. We who are Jews by birth and not quote unquote Gentile sinners know that a man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Christ Jesus. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by observing the law, because by observing the law, no one will be justified. Not Jews, not Gentiles, not Pharisees, not fishermen. It doesn't matter. Again, if you need more on this basic truth, if you've never gone through Pursuit 101 at our library, you should go do that. But now Paul addresses an objection, and maybe you've heard this objection before. If you're a Christian, you've probably heard this before. Here's how you may have heard it. If we're saved by faith plus nothing, does that mean that Christians can all live sinful, self-indulgent lifestyles? Because sometimes people think that way. I'm sure that when these people came from Jerusalem and saw Peter eating this food, I'm sure part of them thought, well, wait, you just believe this stuff so that you can live the way you want to live. You want to live this sinful lifestyle. Here's how Paul says it in verse 17. He says, if while we seek to be justified in Christ alone, not by our works, but by Christ's work, if while we seek to be justified that way, or saved that way, it becomes evident that we ourselves are sinners, does that mean that Christ promotes sin? And here's Paul's answer. Absolutely not. Now, he talks more about this later on in Galatians, and we'll get to that. But here's what he says in verse 18. He says, if I rebuild what I destroyed, I prove that I'm a lawbreaker. Now, maybe you read that and you think, I don't really know what he's talking about there. Let me tell you what's happening here. Paul is pointing out an irony. See, Paul has already put his full trust in Christ and in Christ's work on the cross. So Paul has destroyed the old way by which he was trying to gain God's approval. Remember, Paul was a Pharisee, so he was trying to be justified by obedience to the law. And now he realizes that will never work. So he destroyed that. And he's saying this, but if I rebuild that, if I go back to that, if I go back to reliance on the law, Peter, if you go back to reliance on the law, that's when you're really going to be sinning, because that kind of self-righteousness is the worst kind of sin. If you try to go back to the law, you're spitting in the face of Jesus and what he did. And so what he's saying is, don't go back to that old way. This equation is for real. Salvation is faith plus nothing, for real. That's not just some pie in the sky thing. That's really what Jesus came to do. And so Paul finishes out his point, And he does this so powerfully. I just want to end this video by reading these words together with you, verses 19 through 21. Let's look. It says this. Paul says, "For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." And he says this in verse 21. "I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing." Let's not go back to that old way. Let's not rebuild that old way. Jesus really does save us all by himself. His work on the cross is sufficient for our salvation. Don't go back to trying to work for it. That is self-righteousness, and it will never work. Now, why don't we hit pause right now and talk about this? Sometimes the line between being righteous and self-righteous can get a little blurred, right? There are some rules that it's good out of obedience to Christ that we follow, but there are some where we're just being self-righteous. Now, we're going to talk more about this true righteousness in future chapters, but for now, as a group, can you give some examples of self-righteousness? And why is it so offensive to God? Why don't you talk about that? And then we'll see you next week as we tackle Galatians chapter 3.